The most formidable enemy of the Royal Navy in the 1700s was not the French fleet nor the Spanish Armada. It was a blind, gelatinous mollusk the size of a man's index finger, the Teredo navalis. To defeat this silent eater of oak, shipwrights engaged in a maintenance ritual that looked more like a catastrophe than a repair. They called it the heave down. It required tilting a 2,000-ton fortress of war until its keel broke the surface, stressing the masts to their absolute breaking point. Then, amidst the groan of tortured timber, men would assault the hull with open fire and boiling toxins, balancing on slippery rafts between a wall of flames and the cold harbor water. One slip meant death by crushing or drowning. One spark in the wrong place meant the total loss of the king's ship. This was the most volatile industrial ballet of the pre-industrial age. The maritime chronicles of the 18th century, particularly those referencing the maintenance schedules of the Royal Navy or the merchant fleets of the East India Company, reveal that the most critical battle fought by a ship was not against enemy cannon, but against the silent, ceaseless gnawing of the Teredo navalis and the accumulation of dragging weed. To combat this biological siege, the vessel had to be careened, a process of terrifying physical leverage that began not with hammers, but with the systematic destabilization of the ship's equilibrium. The hull, a massive floating fortification of oak and iron weighing hundreds of tons, had to be intentionally inclined until her keel nearly broke the surface of the water, a feat achieved through the heave down. This was not merely a matter of pulling a rope. It was an industrial ballet of weight displacement, where the ship's guns, ballast, and stores were painstakingly shifted or removed entirely to a hulk, an old, stripped-down vessel permanently moored for this purpose. The stress placed on the lower masts during this operation was immense, requiring them to be reinforced with additional temporary shrouds and outriggers. For if a mast were to snap under the unnatural tension, it would not only cripple the ship, but likely crush the teams of men working the capstans on the careening hulk alongside. Once the floating geometry was altered and the top-heavy vessel began to roll onto her beam ends, the atmosphere in the shipyard shifted from one of calculated labor to acute, suspended tension. The sheer mechanical force required to hold a ship of the line or a heavy merchantman at such an acute angle relied on block and tackle systems of immense proportions, with ropes as thick as a man's arm groaning under the strain. The master shipwright monitored every degree of the list, listening to the complaints of the timber, knowing that the ship's internal structure, the knees, riders, and futtocks, was enduring forces it was never designed to sustain for long periods. A miscalculation in the distribution of the remaining ballast could cause the ship to right herself violently, snapping the purchase blocks like twigs and flinging men into the water or across the deck. Or conversely, to roll too far and take on water through the lower gun ports if they had not been perfectly sealed. The air smelled of sweat and damp hemp, filled with the rhythmic clicking of the capstan pawls, preventing the behemoth from slipping back, locking the vessel in a position of supreme vulnerability where her underbelly was exposed to the light for the first time in years. The human element of this phase was defined by a disciplined silence, broken only by the commands of the boatswain and the creak of stretching fibers, as the margin for error was non-existent. Men worked with the knowledge that they were fighting gravity with primitive machines, turning wooden bars to manipulate thousands of tons of displacement. The physical toll of operating the capstans was grueling, a relentless grind, against resistance that left chests heaving and muscles burning, but the mental strain was sharper. Every laborer knew stories of chains parting or blocks shattering under load, sending shrapnel of iron and elm through the air with the velocity of a cannonball. This preparatory phase was the foundation of the entire maintenance cycle, a high-stakes gamble where the capital investment of the crown or the company hung suspended by hemp and physics. Before a single barnacle could be scraped or a seam caulked, the ship had to be conquered and held in this unnatural submission, creating a workspace that was simultaneously a triumph of proto-industrial engineering and a death trap waiting for a single lapse in concentration. With the copper sheathing of the later decades not yet universal, the exposed bottom of the vessel presented a foul tapestry of marine life, barnacles, mussels, and long trails of seaweed that had to be purged by fire in a process known as breaming. This was, arguably, the most visceral and paradoxical operation in the dockyard, deliberately setting fire to the hull of a wooden ship to save it. Gangs of laborers, often working from floating rafts or stages that bobbed precariously alongside the exposed keel, wielded long iron forks loaded with burning faggots of firs, reeds, or dried brushwood. The objective was to apply enough intense, localized heat to melt the old, fouled pitch and tar, causing the accumulated biological concrete of barnacles and weed to loosen and drop off, without allowing the flames to bite into the oak planking itself. It was a sensory assault of the highest order. The smoke was thick, black, and acrid, a suffocating mixture of burning resin, sulfur, and the stench of roasting marine life that clung to the hair and skin of the workers for weeks, marking them out in any tavern as men of the graving dock. The danger of breaming cannot be overstated, for fire was the nemesis of the wooden fleet, and a spark carried by a rogue gust of wind could ignite the rigging, the tarpaulins, or the dry timber of the shipyard itself. Consequently, this stage of production required a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. While one team applied the fire, another stood ready with wet swabs, buckets of water, and mops, eyes watering from the smoke, ready to douse any flame that lingered a second too long on the hull. The heat radiated from the burning faggots was intense, baking the faces of the men on the rafts who had nowhere to retreat, trapped between the wall of fire and the cold harbor water. They worked in a rhythm dictated by the burn rate of the brushwood, moving along the waterline in a synchronized advance, leaving behind a smoking, charred surface that was instantly attacked by the scrapers. This was not unskilled labor. It required an intuitive understanding of how different timbers reacted to heat, how English oak might char slowly, while softer colonial pine might flare up instantly, and the easy judgment to know exactly when the pitch was fluid enough to strip. This pyrotechnic cleaning method revealed the true state of the ship, stripping away the organic camouflage to expose the ravages of time and travel. As the fire passed and the smoke swirled, the planking lay naked, often revealing the dreaded honeycomb pattern of the teredo worm or the iron sickness, where rusting bolts had rotted the surrounding wood. The breaming gangs were the first line of diagnosis, their torches illuminating the rot that could sink a vessel in a storm. The auditory landscape was dominated by the crackle of dry reeds, the hiss of boiling sap, and the scraping of iron tools against the charred wood, a cacophony of destruction necessary for renewal. It was a dirty, hazardous, and physically exhausting task that bridged the gap between raw destruction and careful preservation, requiring men to wield the most destructive element known to man with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, all while balancing on a slick, moving platform inches above the tide. Once the hull was scraped clean of its charred debris and the seams were recaulked with fresh oakum driven in by the rhythmic mallets of the caulkers, the ship had to be sealed against the ocean once more, a process known as paying. This stage transformed the shipyard into a vast open-air chemical laboratory where the air grew heavy with the fumes of boiling pitch, tallow, rosin, and sulfur. The concoction used to coat the bottom was often a specific, jealously guarded recipe intended to repel the worm and prevent fouling. For ships bound for tropical waters, a white stuff mixture of whale oil, rosin, and brimstone, sulfur, was often preferred over the standard black tar, believed to be more resistant to the heat of the southern sun. Large iron cauldrons, bubbling with this volatile soup, were kept heated over fires on the nearby shore or on the careening hulk, and the molten liquid was transported in buckets to the men waiting on the stages, a logistical chain fraught with the peril of spills that could strip the skin from a man's bone in an instant. The men applying this protective coat worked with mops made of old wool or coarse hair, slathering the boiling mixture onto the underside of the vessel with frantic speed before it could cool and harden. The toxicity of the materials was a constant, silent hazard. The fumes from the boiling sulfur and lead-based additives were noxious, causing respiratory ailments, chronic coughing, and eye irritation that plagued the workforce long after the shift ended. In the confined space between the tilted hull and the water, ventilation was poor, and the workers were essentially enveloped in a cloud of poisonous vapor. They were literally painting the ship with poison to kill the marine life that sought to eat it. And in doing so, they exposed themselves to a cocktail of industrial chemicals that seeped into their pores and lungs. The black stuff, a cheaper mix of tar and pitch, was stickier and messier, turning the men into silhouettes of grime, while the white stuff required precise temperature control to remain spreadable, demanding a constant coordination between the kettle watchers and the painters. Beyond the chemical dangers, the physical position of the workers during the paying process was precarious in the extreme. Working on the bilge, or the lowest parts of the hull, required them to stand on stages that were often slick with dripped grease and tallow, looking up at the massive curvature of the ship that hung over them like a brooding cliff face. If the careening tackles were to slip even a few inches, the hull would descend like a hammer, crushing anyone working beneath the tumble-home. Yet, the work demanded thoroughness. A single missed patch of planking was an open invitation to the worm, a tiny vulnerability that could lead to a catastrophic leak months later in the middle of the Atlantic. The master caulkers inspected the work with ruthless scrutiny, knowing that their reputation and the lives of the crew depended on the integrity of this seal. It was a race against the tide and the cooling of the mixture, a frantic, toxic, and dangerously acrobatic endeavor that sealed the vessel's fate for the years of voyaging to come. With the hull stripped of its fouling and the charred debris swept away by the tide, the shipyard entered its most auditory phase, the resealing of the vessel through caulking. This was not a silent craft. It was a percussive assault that defined the soundscape of every port city from Portsmouth to Boston, a rhythmic, high-pitched ringing of iron on wood that could be heard for miles. The caulkers, considered the aristocracy of the shipyard labor force due to the immense responsibility they bore for the ship's watertight integrity, descended upon the exposed seams with their specialized tools, the crease irons and the distinctively slotted wooden mallets, designed to produce a sharp musical note. If a seam was making water, the old rotten oakum had to be hooked out using a raving iron, a process that often revealed the terrifying state of the planks beneath. It was here, in the damp shadow of the heaved-down hull, that the true condition of the ship was diagnosed. A soft spot in the garboard strake, the devil seam, notoriously difficult to access and closest to the keel, could mean ripping out entire planks, a major surgical intervention that turned a routine cleaning into a week-long reconstruction, halting the entire supply chain and sending ripples of panic through the Admiralty or the counting house owners waiting for their cargo. The material that stood between the sailor and the deep was oakum, the humblest of substances with a grim lineage. It was essentially old rope, junk rigging that had been cut into lengths and picked apart fiber by fiber, often by the fingers of orphans in workhouses or convicts in prisons, before being tarred and rolled into loose strands. The caulker's skill lay in driving this sticky, fibrous mass into the wedge-shaped gaps between the planks with precisely the right amount of force. It was a task of deceptive complexity. Strike the iron too lightly, and the oakum would be slack, washing out in the first heavy gale and springing a leak. Strike it too hard, and the wedge action would split the oak planking itself, causing irreparable structural damage. The master caulker worked by feel and by sound, listening to the ring of the mallet change pitch as the seam hardened and filled. This work required a peculiar physical stamina, forcing men to work with their arms raised overhead or twisted into cramping contortions to reach the underside of the bilge, hammering thousands of blows a day while suspended on wet scaffolding, their bodies vibrating with every impact. The social hierarchy of the yard was visible in the seam lines. The apprentices were often relegated to spinning the oakum or paying the easier upper seams, while the master craftsman tackled the critical underwater body. The tension was palpable. A holiday, a missed or poorly caulked section, was considered a cardinal sin of the trade. Inspectors would prowl the stages, sometimes using a sharp tool to probe the firmness of the oakum. If a tool penetrated too easily, the caulker could be docked pay or fired on the spot. This was quality control in its rawest form, driven by the knowledge that once the ship was righted, these seams would be buried underwater, inaccessible until the next careening years later. The caulkers worked in a cloud of dust and fibers, their ears ringing permanently, knowing that the safety of hundreds of men and the value of the empire's trade relied entirely on the friction of tarred hemp driven into a quarter-inch gap between two pieces of wood. The final act of the careening drama was the righting of the ship, a procedure that possessed a kinetic danger distinct from the heaving down. Gravity, which had been fought tooth and nail to tilt the vessel, was now an eager accomplice, waiting to reclaim its dominance. The tension on the masthead tackles was eased with excruciating slowness, coordinated by the boatswain's whistle, to allow the ship to roll back onto an even keel. This was not a simple release. If the vessel was allowed to right herself too quickly, the momentum could cause her to roll violently in the opposite direction, snapping moorings, smashing the accompanying lighters, or dislodging the ballast that had been shifted inside. The interior of the ship, still a chaotic cavern of displaced cannons and barrels, had to be managed carefully. As the keel sank back into the murky water, the shipwrights watched the water level rise against the newly cleaned and paid hull, checking frantically for the weeping of any failed seams. It was the moment of truth where the work of the past weeks was hydrostatically tested by the ocean itself. Once the ship was floating level, the logistical nightmare of reloading began, a reverse engineering of the unloading process that required a deep understanding of the vessel's trim. A ship was not merely a container, it was a balanced instrument. The heavy ballast, stones, iron pigs, or gravel, had to be restowed low in the hold with mathematical precision. Place too much weight forward, and the ship would be down by the head, plowing into waves rather than riding over them. Place too much aft, and she would drag her stern, losing speed and maneuverability. The laborers, now exhausted from the careening, became stevedores, hoisting tons of water casks, salt beef barrels, and gunpowder kegs back into the belly of the ship. The guns, massive iron tubes weighing thousands of pounds, had to be winched back onto their carriages, a process that splintered decks and crushed fingers. This phase was driven by a frantic urgency. Every day the ship spent in the harbor was a day of lost profit or tactical disadvantage. The air was filled with the shouts of officers driving the men to speed, the creak of the yardarms hoisting supplies, and the heavy thud of cargo settling into the hold. When the ship finally cast off, she was a transformed creature. The bottom, now smooth and slick with tallow and sulfur, would cut through the water with significantly less resistance, perhaps adding a knot or two to her top speed, a margin that meant the difference between capturing a prize or escaping a predator. The crew, observing the clean heels of their vessel, felt a surge of renewed confidence, even as the stench of the Breaming fire still lingered faintly in the timbers. Behind them, the dockyard remained a scar of industry. The water muddy with ash, the hulks groaning under the weight of the next patient, and the workforce, blackened by tar and smoke, already turning their eyes to the next vessel limping into the harbor. The cycle of the Careening was a perpetual loop of destruction and renewal, a testament to the fact that the mastery of the seas was built not on the romance of the horizon, but on the dirty, dangerous, and backbreaking labor of the shipyard floor. The survival of an empire often rested on the shoulders of men whose names were never recorded, laboring in the dangerous shadow of the hull. We are dedicated to bringing their reality back to the surface, but we need your help to keep these stories afloat. Honor their forgotten craft by subscribing to the channel and sharing this log with fellow history enthusiasts. In the comments below, tell us, which part of this brutal process would you have feared the most?